Princess Owusu Ansah. Princess Owusu Ansah was 18 years old in February of 2023, living in Royston, Hertfordshire, while maintaining connections to her Ghanaian heritage. When she became convinced that a former friend had crossed a line with her boyfriend, her response would shock the nation and demonstrate how social media has transformed both crime and criminal investigations. On February 2nd, 2023, Owusu Ansah traveled to the Dog Kennel Hill estate in Dulwich, London, to confront her former friend. What began as an accusation quickly escalated into a sustained assault that she documented on her mobile phone. The footage captured her accusing the victim of inappropriate behavior with her boyfriend, using language that left no doubt about her anger. Owusu Ansah poured boiling water from a kettle over her former friend, who attempted to shield herself under a duvet. The scalding water caused significant burns, but she did not stop there. She physically struck the victim repeatedly, then retrieved a knife and threatened her by banging it against a radiator before using the weapon to inflict a wound to the victim's leg. What made this case particularly unusual was Owusu Ansah's decision to broadcast her actions. After completing the assault, she posted the video to Snapchat, where it quickly went viral. This decision suggested a desire to humiliate her victim publicly, or a failure to comprehend the consequences of creating permanent digital evidence. The victim managed to escape and flee into the street, seeking help from neighbors. She was transported to King's College Hospital for treatment of burns and puncture wounds that, while serious, were not life-threatening. The investigation moved swiftly thanks to the viral video. A concerned member of the public reported it to the Metropolitan Police, providing direct visual evidence. Officers identified Owusu Ansah from the footage and arrested her on February 5th. At her court appearance in March, Owusu Ansah entered guilty pleas at Inner London Crown Court. Senior Crown Prosecution Service prosecutor Claudette Hamilton expressed hope that the early guilty pleas would help the victim feel that justice was being pursued. Detective Constable Abigail Elliott praised the victim's courage throughout the ordeal. On May 9, 2023, Owusu Ansah was sentenced to 3 years imprisonment at Croydon Magistrates Court. The sentence reflected the seriousness of the premeditated assault while taking into account her age and guilty pleas. The case became a teaching moment about allowing emotions to override judgment and the permanent consequences of documenting illegal actions on social media. As of 2025, having been sentenced in May of 2023, Owusu Ansah may have completed a portion of her sentence. While that case involved public documentation, the next story would unfold behind closed doors with family ties. That made the betrayal even more shocking. Karma Douglas. Karma Douglas was 17 years old in October of 2025, living in Vancouver, Washington, when an evening that should have been routine ended in tragedy. Douglas had connections to the Trotter family through friendship networks, creating relationships that seemed built on trust. However, the events of October 3rd would shatter that trust completely. Chantal Trotter, 40 years old, had been providing support to Douglas, including occasional housing assistance. Her son would later describe her as loving and dedicated to helping others. On that October evening, Douglas was at Trotter's home, reportedly in some kind of supervisory capacity with one of Trotter's family members. What began as a disagreement escalated in ways no one could have anticipated. According to investigative reports, Trotter asked Douglas to leave the residence following some kind of dispute. Rather than complying, Douglas allegedly became physical. Witnesses and evidence later suggested that Douglas pushed Trotter against a wall and then restricted her breathing in a manner that proved fatal. Investigators noted that Douglas appeared to be under some level of intoxication. Douglas contacted emergency services herself, a decision that investigators found significant. When law enforcement arrived, they found Trotter unresponsive and Douglas with visible evidence connecting her to what had occurred. Forensic examination revealed blood on Douglas's clothing and minor scratches on her arm. A K-9 unit located a damaged cellular phone that became part of the evidence. Douglas's behavior when approached by law enforcement raised concerns. Officers noted that she appeared intoxicated and was largely uncooperative with initial attempts to understand what had happened. This lack of cooperation complicated the early investigation. Though physical evidence and witness statements ultimately provided clarity, one striking aspect was Douglas's apparent lack of any prior criminal record. Court documents noted that she had no documented history of similar behavior, making this incident seem like an aberration. This raised questions about what factors had contributed to such an extreme and tragic outcome. Darius Jackson, Trotter's son, spoke about his mother in the aftermath, describing her as someone who had been trying to help Douglas as a family friend. He emphasized that his mother had been a positive force in people's lives. The family struggled to understand how someone they had tried to assist could have responded with such finality. Douglas was arrested at the scene and charged with second-degree intentional harm, a serious felony. The decision to try her as an adult reflected the severity of the case. Bail was set at $200,000. As of late 2025, Douglas remains in custody awaiting trial proceedings. Her arraignment and subsequent court appearances have been documented, but the case has not yet proceeded to trial. The tragic nature of the incident has resonated throughout the Vancouver community, raising questions about intervention and support systems for struggling youth. From a single tragic confrontation to a carefully planned familial betrayal, the next case would reveal how rebellion can turn deadly. Cassandra Bjorge. Cassandra Bjorge, known as Cassie, was 17 years old in April of 2017 when she and her boyfriend Johnny Ryder committed acts that would shock Lawrenceville. Bjorge's relationship with her grandparents, Wendy and Randall Bjorge, had deteriorated significantly, creating a household environment fraught with tension. Bjorge's mother, Amanda Sterling, had relinquished custody after Cassie's behavior became increasingly difficult to manage. Sterling described how her daughter had become out of control in the approximately 18 months before the incident. Law enforcement records showed that police had been called to the Bjorge residence 31 times between 2015 and 2017, responding to various domestic disputes. In April of 2017, Bjorge and Ryder made a decision during a meeting at a local park. They planned to end the lives of Cassie's grandparents as a means of escaping what they perceived as an intolerable living situation. The planning demonstrated premeditation rather than impulse. Cassie used a tire iron to strike her grandmother Wendy, inflicting serious trauma before using additional methods. Ryder employed similar tactics against Randall. After completing their terrible acts, they took steps to conceal what they had done, using bleach in an attempt to mask evidence. What followed was perhaps even more disturbing. Rather than fleeing immediately, Bjorge and Ryder remained in the house for several days. They told friends that the grandparents were away on vacation, using this cover story while they ransacked the home. They located and stole approximately $1,000 from a safe and incredibly hosted friends at the house during this period. The deception unraveled when concerned relatives requested a welfare check. Responding officers discovered the scene and quickly identified Bjorge and Ryder as suspects. The couple was located after they had already assaulted Ryder's sister in an apparent attempt to carry out broader plans. When law enforcement closed in, both inflicted wounds upon themselves in failed attempts, leading to a tense standoff. During interrogation, Bjorge expressed that she had wanted to escape from her family situation. She stated it felt like she didn't even have a family anymore and acknowledged feeling terrible, describing herself as the worst person on the planet. Both faced charges, including multiple counts. The evidence was overwhelming. Both entered guilty pleas, with Bjorge receiving a life sentence without the possibility of parole for 53 years. Ryder received a similar sentence. As of 2025, both remain incarcerated in Georgia. When does family conflict cross the line from manageable to catastrophic? While that case involved planned family betrayal, the next story would reveal how a public altercation could turn fatal in moments. Marissa Smith. Marissa Smith was 17 years old in September of 2022, when an afternoon at Wildwood Park in Louisville, Ohio, ended in tragedy. Unlike cases involving long-term planning, this incident emerged from a group confrontation that escalated with shocking speed. September 13th began as what appeared to be a typical gathering at a public park. Wildwood Park served as a common meeting spot where people came to socialize. However, tensions that day led to a confrontation involving multiple individuals, creating a chaotic scene that would result in Michael Morris Jr., 22, losing his life. The details of what sparked the initial confrontation remain somewhat unclear. What is clear is that a group altercation developed, with numerous people involved. During this melee, Smith was provided with a knife by another individual, introducing a weapon into an already volatile situation. Witnesses provided varying accounts of exactly how the fatal interaction occurred. Some described Smith advancing toward Morris while screaming, wielding the weapon. Smith herself would later claim that Morris had walked into the blade. However, forensic evidence and witness statements painted a different picture. Morris suffered a wound to his chest that proved fatal. In the chaos that followed, rather than immediately seeking help, evidence suggested that Smith and others fled the scene. This decision to leave Morris without rendering aid would become a central point during the trial. When emergency services finally arrived, Morris was beyond saving. The investigation involved interviewing numerous witnesses, each providing pieces of the puzzle. Investigators identified Smith as the person who had inflicted the fatal wound, and she was taken into custody. The case proceeded with Smith being tried as an adult. The trial in May of 2023 presented the prosecution's case that Smith had intentionally caused Morris's passing. The defense attempted to argue that the situation was more complex. However, the jury, after hearing all evidence, including witness testimony and forensic analysis, returned guilty verdicts on charges including intentional harm. At sentencing, Morris's family addressed the court. His aunt, Tara Burns, delivered particularly pointed remarks, emphasizing that Smith had possessed a cell phone and could have called for help, but instead chose to leave Morris. Burns characterized this choice as unforgivable. The family painted a picture of Morris as a beloved son and nephew, whose life had been cut short senselessly. The judge sentenced Smith to 15 years to life in prison, reflecting the severity while accounting for Smith's age. She must serve a minimum of 15 years before parole consideration. As of 2025, Marissa Smith remains incarcerated in an Ohio correctional facility, where she will not be eligible for release until at least 2037, while that case emerged from group dynamics. The next story would reveal how mental health crises within a family can lead to unspeakable tragedy. Claire Miller. Claire Elena Miller was 14 years old in February of 2021, when a mental health crisis reached its catastrophic conclusion in Manheim Township, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Miller had been growing up in what appeared to be a loving, stable family environment with her parents, Mark and Marie Miller, and her older sister Helen. Claire had achieved social media fame as a content creator on TikTok, accumulating approximately 22,000 followers. To those who followed her, she appeared to be a typical adolescent. She attended Lancaster Country Day School and was generally well-liked. However, what many did not know was that Claire was receiving treatment for depression and experiencing increasingly disturbing psychological symptoms. Helen Miller, at 19, had cerebral palsy requiring additional care. Claire had taken on some responsibilities in helping care for Helen, a role that family dynamics experts later suggested may have created feelings of being overshadowed. While there is no evidence that Claire resented Helen's needs, the family structure meant significant attention was directed toward ensuring Helen's well-being. In the weeks leading up to February 22nd, Claire's mental health had been deteriorating. She had been experiencing what mental health professionals later identified as auditory hallucinations, hearing voices that were not real. These hallucinations had been commanding her to commit acts of harm, creating internal psychological pressure. This represented a psychotic break where a person loses touch with reality. On the early morning of February 22nd, Claire acted on the commands she believed she was hearing. She inflicted multiple wounds to Helen's neck while her sister slept. The scene showed blood evidence both inside the home and on the snow outside. In the immediate aftermath, Claire contacted emergency services. The 911 call captured her repeatedly, stating that she had harmed her sister, demonstrating awareness of what she had done, even while in her psychotic state. When law enforcement arrived, they found Claire with blood on her clothing and Helen beyond help. The investigation was straightforward in establishing what had occurred, but complex in understanding why. Forensic evidence confirmed the nature of Helen's injuries. The psychological component required extensive evaluation by mental health professionals who examined Claire's history and psychotic symptoms. Claire's defense team worked to have her case handled in juvenile court, but the courts ultimately decided that the severity required adult court proceedings, though they would still take her age and mental health into account. Claire entered a plea of guilty but mentally ill to third-degree intentional harm, acknowledging both her responsibility and the role mental illness had played. At sentencing, District Attorney Heather Adams acknowledged the unthinkable pain while noting that the sentence needed to balance multiple factors. Judge Jeffrey Wright described the events as incoherently tragic. Claire was sentenced to 12 1/2 to 40 years in a Pennsylvania correctional facility, where she would receive mental health treatment. As of 2025, Claire Miller remains incarcerated, receiving ongoing mental health treatment. From a household torn apart by mental illness to a street confrontation fueled by substances, the next case would show how impulsive decisions can have permanent consequences. Jordan Jobson. Jordan Jobson was 15 years old on August 2nd, 2007, when a night out in Wallsend, North Tyneside, England, ended with the loss of a young mother's life. Jobson's case demonstrated how the combination of youth, substance use, and poor decision-making can result in irreversible tragedy. Samantha Magin was 18 years old and had recently become a mother, experiencing her first evening out since giving birth. She had no way of knowing this ordinary evening out would be her last, or that she would become entangled in a confrontation that had nothing to do with her. The evening found Jobson in a highly intoxicated state, having consumed significant quantities of alcohol along with taking other substances that further impaired her judgment. She had heard about some kind of dispute involving people she knew, and in her intoxicated state, she made the decision to arm herself with a knife, later claiming she intended to break up the fight. When Jobson encountered the group, Samantha Magin was present, apparently trying to intervene herself. Rather than calming the confrontation, Jobson's arrival with a weapon escalated it dramatically. In the chaos that ensued, Jobson used the knife against Madgen multiple times. Initial reports indicated 10 wounds, but later forensic examination revealed approximately 43 separate injuries. One of these wounds pierced Madgen's lung and severed an artery near her heart, causing catastrophic blood loss. Despite emergency response, Madgen could not be saved. She left behind her newborn infant, her partner, her parents, and her siblings. Jobson was arrested based on witness accounts. When the case went to trial at Newcastle Crown Court in 2008, Jobson's defense argued she had not intended serious harm, suggesting the attack was impulsive and fueled by intoxication. However, prosecutors presented evidence about the nature and number of wounds. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict. The sentencing became a source of ongoing controversy. Initially, Jobson was sentenced to life with a minimum term of 15 years. However, this sentence was later reduced to 12 years and then to 11 years, with appellate judges determining the original term had been manifestly excessive. Madgen's family was devastated. In 2017, Madgen's sister Carly expressed frustration, stating that 15 years was absolutely nothing, and describing the reductions as fundamentally unfair. The family felt the justice system had failed to adequately value Samantha's life. Jobson was released on license in late 2020. However, in 2021, she was recalled to custody for breaching release conditions. Jobson was released again in 2022 and was reportedly living in proximity to Madgen's family. Madgen's mother spoke to media in 2025, describing Jobson as a ticking time bomb. As of 2025, the Madgen family continues to grieve and advocate for stronger consideration of victims' families in sentencing decisions. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. While that case showed how substances can fuel tragedy, the next story would reveal how revenge can motivate even the youngest to commit calculated acts. Joy Afe-Cafe. Joy Afe-Cafe was 14 years old in October of 2023 when she orchestrated an act of revenge that would shock Minna, Nigeria, and highlight the dangers of unresolved workplace conflicts even in domestic settings. Afe-Cafe had been employed as a housemaid by Funmilola Adefolalu, a lecturer at the Federal University of Technology in Minna. But her employment had ended abruptly after just 3 weeks when issues arose regarding her conduct. The relationship between Afe-Cafe and Adefolalu had deteriorated quickly during those 3 weeks of employment. Afe-Cafe was dismissed from her position after being accused of taking items that did not belong to her, a termination that apparently left her feeling humiliated and angry. Rather than accepting the consequences of her actions and moving forward, Afe-Cafe began plotting revenge against the woman who had dismissed her. This planning would involve recruiting others to help her carry out her intentions. Afe-Cafe reached out to 2 classmates from her school in the Gibeganu community, identified as Walex and Smart, enlisting them in her plan. The 3 young people developed a strategy to target Adefolalu at her home, where Afe-Cafe had previously worked and was familiar with the layout and routines. The plan demonstrated a disturbing level of premeditation for individuals so young, showing that they had thought through how to gain access and what they intended to do once inside. On the evening of October 28, 2023, the plan was executed. Afe-Cafe used her familiarity with the residents to lure Adefolalu to open her gate, exploiting the lecturer's trust or lack of suspicion about the young person who had recently worked for her. Once the gate was opened, all 3 attackers entered the property and proceeded to carry out a sustained assault on Adefalalu that involved multiple methods and weapons. The attack included beating Adefalalu with a stool and using sharp objects to inflict numerous wounds to various parts of her body, including her stomach, hands, and legs. The violence continued until Adefalalu was no longer able to defend herself or call for help. Adefalalu's body was discovered the following day when members of her church became concerned after she failed to appear for services and went to check on her welfare. The scene they encountered was horrific, showing the extent of the violence that had been inflicted. Law enforcement was immediately contacted, and an intensive investigation was launched to identify those responsible. The investigative process involved canvassing the neighborhood and interviewing people who might have information about anyone seen near Adefalalu's residence. Through these inquiries, investigators were able to identify Afekafe as a person of interest based on her recent employment and dismissal. When brought in for questioning, Afekafe initially attempted to deny involvement. But as investigators presented evidence and applied pressure, her story began to break down. Eventually, Afekafe confessed to her role in the attack and implicated her two classmates. During her confession, she provided details about how the plan had been developed and executed, stating that it was Walex who had suggested that if they left Adefalalu alive, there would be consequences, and that the others had then proceeded with ensuring she would not survive. This statement suggested that while Afekafe had initiated the plan for revenge, the escalation to a fatal outcome may have been driven by the group dynamics and the influence of the others involved. In July of 2025, Afekafe was sentenced to life imprisonment for culpable homicide. Under Nigerian law, her age at the time of the offense spared her from the possibility of capital punishment. But the life sentence ensured she would spend decades behind bars. She also received an additional 10 years for the robbery charges, to be served concurrently with the life sentence. The sentences for Walex and Smart were similarly severe, reflecting the court's determination to hold all participants accountable. As of 2025, Joy Afekafe remains imprisoned in Nigeria, where she will spend the foreseeable future. Her two accomplices are similarly incarcerated, serving their own sentences for their roles in the attack. From workplace revenge to a family conflict that reached a breaking point, the next case would show how untreated mental illness can have devastating consequences. Isabella Guzman. Isabella Guzman was 18 years old on August 28, 2013, when a long simmering conflict with her mother exploded in Aurora, Colorado, resulting in one of the most disturbing cases involving mental illness and family violence. Guzman's relationship with her mother, Yunmi Hoy, had been fraught for years, marked by behavioral issues, disagreements over rules and discipline, and underlying psychological problems that had gone inadequately treated. Guzman had experienced behavioral problems from a young age and had dropped out of high school, suggesting ongoing struggles with education and authority. Her childhood had been complicated by family dynamics, including periods where she lived with her biological father, Robert, starting around age 7 due to difficulties in the household. Later, she returned to live with her mother, Yunmi Hoy, and stepfather, Ryan Hoy. The parents were Jehovah's Witnesses, a religious background that Guzman would later claim contributed to her problems, though she left the faith at 14. In the months and weeks leading up to the tragic events, the relationship between Isabella and her mother had deteriorated to a crisis point. There were frequent arguments over household rules, Isabella's behavior, and the direction of her life. On the morning of August 28th, tensions reached a boiling point when Isabella sent a threatening email to her mother that simply stated she would pay for their conflicts. This message was alarming enough that Hoy contacted law enforcement, and officers visited the residence to assess the situation. During that police visit, officers spoke with both Isabella and her mother, attempting to mediate the dispute and ensure everyone's safety. The officers deemed the situation resolved and departed, a decision that would haunt the responding personnel in hindsight. What they could not have known was that Isabella was experiencing severe mental health symptoms that would soon manifest in the most terrible way possible. That evening, Yoon-mi Hoi was taking a shower in the family bathroom, a routine activity that should have been safe in her own home. Her stepfather Ryan heard unusual thumping sounds coming from the bathroom and went to investigate, discovering a scene of horror. Isabella was standing over her mother's body with weapons in hand, having inflicted an almost unimaginable number of wounds. Forensic analysis would later determine that Yoon-mi Hoi had been struck 79 times, with wounds distributed across her head, neck, and torso. Ryan Hoi immediately called emergency services, but there was nothing that could be done to save Yoon-mi. Isabella fled the scene, escaping into the night and triggering a search operation. She was located the following day in a parking garage and taken into custody without incident. The question that immediately arose was not whether Isabella had committed the act. The evidence was overwhelming. But rather what her mental state had been and whether she could be held criminally responsible. The investigation into Isabella's background and mental health revealed troubling information. She had been suffering from schizophrenia, a serious mental illness characterized by hallucinations and delusions. In Isabella's case, her psychotic symptoms included a belief that her mother was not actually Yoon-mi Hoi, but rather someone named Cecilia, and that this person needed to be eliminated to save the world. These delusional beliefs had apparently been building in her mind, creating a distorted reality where the violent act seemed necessary and justified. The court accepted the insanity defense after reviewing the extensive psychiatric evaluations. Rather than being sentenced to prison, Isabella was committed indefinitely to the Colorado Mental Health Institute at Pueblo, a secure psychiatric facility where she would receive treatment for her schizophrenia while being prevented from posing a danger to herself or others. As of 2025, Isabella Guzman remains committed to the Colorado Mental Health Institute, where she continues to receive treatment. Her case continues to be studied by those interested in the intersection of mental illness and the criminal justice system. While mental illness drove that tragedy, the next case would reveal how family conflict over discipline could motivate an unthinkable conspiracy. Jermaine Lewis. Jermaine Lewis, also spelled Jermaine, was 16 years old in October of 2022 when she made a decision that would forever shatter her family and end her mother's life in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The relationship between Lewis and her mother, Markesia Stone, had become increasingly strained over issues that many families face. Disagreements about rules, discipline, and living arrangements. However, Lewis's response to these normal parent-child conflicts would be anything but normal. Markesia Stone was 33 years old, a single mother raising Lewis and 3 other offspring in their Highland Club apartment complex. Those who knew Stone described her as a dedicated parent who worked hard to provide for her family and maintain structure in the household. Her father, Marvin Palmer, would later emphasize that his daughter had been a good mother who did not deserve what happened to her. Stone had been known to enforce rules and discipline when she felt it was necessary, a parenting approach that apparently created friction with Lewis. To execute this plan, Lewis reached out to Dwayne Barfield, another 16-year-old, and allegedly offered him payment to carry out an attack on her mother. The arrangement between Lewis and Barfield represented a conspiracy to commit one of the most serious crimes imaginable, with Lewis serving as the architect of the plan and Barfield agreeing to be the instrument of its execution. On October 12, 2022, Barfield arrived at the Highland Club apartment complex where the Stone family lived. Lewis's 3 siblings were present in the home when the attack occurred, a fact that made the situation even more traumatic. The young ones who witnessed or heard what happened would carry that trauma for the rest of their lives. Barfield proceeded to carry out the attack on Markeisha Stone, using a firearm to end her life in her own home. The investigation that followed moved relatively quickly due to Barfield's eventual cooperation with law enforcement. When questioned by detectives, Barfield confessed to his role in the attack and, crucially, implicated Lewis as the person who had orchestrated the entire plan. His statements provided investigators with the information they needed to understand that this was not a random act of violence, but rather a calculated conspiracy involving Stone's own daughter. Both Lewis and Barfield were arrested and charged with serious offenses. Lewis was charged as a principal to second-degree intentional harm, a charge that recognized her role in planning and facilitating the attack, even though she had not personally carried it out. Barfield faced direct charges related to the act itself, as well as weapon possession. Both young people were held without bond, reflecting the severity of the charges and the court's assessment that they posed a danger to the community. The case proceeded through the Louisiana court system over the following years. In April of 2025, Lewis entered a guilty plea to the charges against her, accepting responsibility for her role in her mother's passing. The guilty plea likely came as part of a negotiated agreement with prosecutors, avoiding the need for a trial that would have forced family members to relive the tragedy in detail. At sentencing, Lewis received a life imprisonment term. Though unlike some life sentences, this one came with the possibility of parole eligibility at some point in the future. The sentence reflected both the gravity of the offense and Lewis's age at the time it was committed. While she would spend many years, potentially decades, in prison, there remains at least a theoretical possibility that she could one day be released if she demonstrates rehabilitation, and if a parole board determines that she no longer poses a threat. As of 2025, Jermaine Lewis is serving her life sentence in a Louisiana correctional facility, where she will remain for the foreseeable future. Her 3 siblings continue their lives without their mother, forever affected by the events of October 12th. From a planned family attack to an encounter that began online, the next case would show how a dating app meeting could turn deadly. Emma Cusack. Emma Cusack was 17 years old in June of 2023 when she connected with a man on the dating application Bumble, beginning an interaction that would end in tragedy at a Las Vegas hotel. The case would highlight the dangers that can arise from online connections and the sometimes devastating consequences when situations spiral out of control. Charlie Satrustige, 36 years old, matched with Cusack on the dating platform, and they agreed to meet in person. On June 28, 2023, they met up at the Luxor Hotel on the Las Vegas Strip, one of the city's major resort properties. The two apparently spent time together, with Cusack later indicating they had purchased beverages during their time at the hotel. What should have been a relatively straightforward meeting between 2 people who had connected online would instead end with one person losing their life. The exact sequence of events in that hotel room has been disputed, with Cusack providing different accounts at different times. Initially, she claimed that she had acted in self-defense, suggesting that Satrustige had become aggressive or threatening in some way that prompted her to protect herself. However, she later admitted that her actual intention had been to commit robbery, and that she had demanded that Satrustige hand over his belongings before the situation escalated. According to Cusack's account, when she demanded his possessions, Satrustige made a sudden movement toward her, which she interpreted as a lunge or attack. In response, she used a firearm that she had brought to the hotel room shooting Satrustagi in the head. The wound proved fatal, ending his life in what transformed from a dating app meetup into a homicide scene. After shooting Satrustagi, Cusack proceeded to take items from the hotel room that belonged to him. She collected his wallet, mobile phones, and car keys, suggesting that regardless of how the shooting had occurred, she was intent on benefiting materially from the encounter. These thefts would later factor into the charges filed against her, as they demonstrated consciousness of wrongdoing and an intent to profit from the situation. Rather than fleeing and attempting to disappear, Cusack made a decision that investigators found significant. She contacted law enforcement herself, calling to report what had occurred. During this call, she expressed that she had not meant to shoot Satrustagi, but indicated that she had felt she had no other options and nowhere else to go. This statement suggested a level of panic and possibly some regret about what had transpired. Though it did not explain why she had brought a weapon to the meeting or why she had attempted robbery, Cusack turned herself into authorities and was taken into custody. The investigation that followed involved processing the hotel room crime scene, examining the weapon used, reviewing surveillance footage from the hotel, and analyzing Cusack's statements. The evidence painted a picture of a situation where Cusack had come to the meeting armed and with at least some intention to take Satrustagi's property, though whether she had planned from the beginning to use the weapon remained a question. Cusack was charged with multiple serious offenses, including open charges related to taking a life, robbery, and grand larceny. The open charge structure allowed prosecutors flexibility in pursuing different levels of the offense, depending on what they could prove about Cusack's intent and state of mind. Being charged as an adult, despite her age, reflected the severity of the allegations and Nevada's laws regarding serious felonies committed by those close to 18. Cusack was held without bond pending trial, a decision that reflected both the seriousness of the charges and concerns about her potentially fleeing or posing a danger if released. The case proceeded through pre-trial proceedings over the following months, with Cusack's defense team working to negotiate a possible plea agreement while prosecutors evaluated their options. In September of 2024, Cusack was sentenced to 11 to 27 years in prison, following what appears to have been either a guilty plea or a conviction at trial. The sentence structure means she must serve a minimum of 11 years before becoming eligible for parole consideration, with the possibility of serving up to 27 years, depending on her behavior in prison and parole board decisions. As of 2025, Emma Cusack is serving her sentence in a Nevada correctional facility, where she will remain for at least the next decade. Satrustagi's family was left to mourn his loss and grapple with the circumstances that led to his passing. From a single deadly encounter to a pattern of violence, the next case would reveal someone suspected in multiple incidents. Leslie Garcia Juarez. Leslie Garcia Juarez was 16 years old when she became linked to two separate shooting incidents in Gwinnett County, Georgia, occurring approximately 1 year apart. The cases would demonstrate how difficult it can be to identify patterns of violence and how long investigations can take to connect different incidents to the same perpetrator. The first incident occurred on December 30th, 2019, when 19-year-old Ociel Montano was found with a fatal gunshot wound to the head in an abandoned apartment in Norcross. The location was a vacant unit, suggesting that the meeting between Montano and his attacker had been planned or that he had been lured there for some reason. The crime scene investigation revealed limited evidence, and initial efforts to identify suspects or establish a motive proved challenging. Almost exactly 1 year later, on December 29, 2020, another young man, 22-year-old Adaf Amable, was found shot in Duluth, another area within Gwinnett County. The similarities between the two cases, young male victims, gunshot wounds to the head, locations within the same county, began to raise questions among investigators about whether they might be connected. The investigation into the 2020 incident led police to identify Juarez as a suspect. Once she was arrested for Amable's case, investigators began looking more closely at whether she might have been involved in other unsolved matters. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation became involved, and through their analysis of evidence and witness interviews, they determined that Juarez should also be charged in connection with Montano's death from 2019. The motives in both cases have not been clearly established in public records. Unlike many cases where relationships between victims and perpetrators are readily apparent, the connections between Juarez and her alleged victims remain unclear. Investigators have not publicly disclosed whether the shootings were related to disputes, whether they involved criminal activity that both parties were engaged in, or whether there were other factors at play. What is clear from the charges filed is that authorities believe Juarez was directly involved in both incidents. She faces charges of felony intentional harm and aggravated assault in both cases, serious felonies that carry significant potential prison sentences if she is convicted. The decision to charge her as an adult rather than handling the cases in juvenile court reflects both Georgia's laws regarding serious violent offenses and the nature of the allegations against her. The fact that both victims were shot in the head suggests a level of intent to cause fatal harm rather than merely to injure or threaten. This detail has been significant in the legal proceedings, as it speaks to the question of premeditation and intent that prosecutors must establish to secure convictions on the most serious charges. As of 2025, Juarez's cases remain in the court system, with trial proceedings pending. The legal process for both cases continues to unfold, with prosecutors and defense attorneys working through pre-trial matters. Given the seriousness of the charges and the fact that she is being tried as an adult, Juarez faces the possibility of spending decades in prison if convicted on all counts. From individual cases to a group conspiracy, the final story would reveal how multiple teenagers could come together with deadly intent. Christy Parisian and Jaslyn Smith. Christy Parisian, 17, and Jaslyn Smith, 16, became involved in October of 2021 in a conspiracy that would end with the death of their high school classmate in Miramar, Florida. The case would demonstrate how romantic jealousy and peer influence can combine to create a deadly situation, and how young people can make catastrophic decisions when caught up in group dynamics. The central figure in the conspiracy was Andre Clements, who had recently broken up with his girlfriend. Clements viewed 18-year-old Dwight Grant as a rival for his ex-girlfriend's affections, creating a situation where jealousy and perceived competition fueled dangerous thinking. Rather than dealing with these feelings in healthy ways, Clements began plotting revenge against Grant, and he recruited Parisian and Smith to help him carry out his plan. The three conspirators developed a strategy to lure Grant to a location where they could attack him. They used text messages to communicate with Grant, convincing him to meet them at an apartment complex stairwell in Miramar. The choice of location, an enclosed stairwell, suggested planning about where the attack could occur with reduced risk of immediate intervention or witnesses. On October 17, 2021, Grant arrived at the agreed-upon location, apparently unaware of the danger he was walking into. What he thought might be a conversation or confrontation turned into a coordinated attack involving all three conspirators. Clements, Parisian, and Smith assaulted Grant using multiple weapons, including a sword and knives, inflicting numerous wounds. During the attack, Parisian and Smith physically held Grant down, preventing him from defending himself or escaping while Clements used the weapons. After the attack was complete and Grant had sustained fatal injuries, the three conspirators attempted to cover their tracks. they disposed of evidence, including the weapons used in the attack and clothing that had become blood-stained during the incident. However, their efforts to conceal their involvement would ultimately prove unsuccessful due to modern investigative techniques. Grant's body was discovered 2 days later, on October 19th, triggering an intensive investigation. Surveillance cameras in the area had captured footage of the attack and the individuals involved, providing law enforcement with crucial visual evidence. Additionally, investigators obtained access to text messages between the conspirators and between them and Grant, which revealed the planning that had gone into luring him to the location. The text messages were particularly damning, as they showed not only the coordination of the meeting, but also prior discussions about intentions. Messages from Clements referenced that harmful actions were coming soon, demonstrating premeditation and planning rather than a spontaneous act of passion. Arrested and charged as adults with serious offenses related to Grant's passing. The evidence against them was overwhelming, including the surveillance footage, the text message records, witness statements, and forensic evidence from the scene. Faced with this mountain of evidence, defense attorneys for Parisian and Smith worked to negotiate plea agreements that might result in somewhat reduced sentences compared to what they might face if convicted at trial. Parisian and Smith attempted to argue that they had been under Clements' influence and that they believed they were participating in a physical confrontation rather than a planned ending of Grant's life. However, prosecutors presented evidence showing that both young women had been active participants who had helped restrain the victim, making them equally culpable regardless of whose idea the plot had originally been. In August of 2024, both Parisian and Smith pleaded guilty to second-degree intentional harm charges. They were each sentenced to 25 years in prison, followed by additional years of probation after their release. The sentences reflected both the severity of their actions and their ages at the time of the offense. Clements, as the primary instigator and the person who had wielded the weapons, received a harsher sentence of 40 years. As of 2025, both Christy Parisian and Jaslyn Smith are serving their 25-year sentences in Florida correctional facilities. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.